Hello, everybody. This is Patrick Cooke. I am Oxford Business Group's regional editor for Asia, and I'm recording this in our office in Manila. Joining me down the line from Jakarta, which is an equally bustling and dynamic Southeast Asian city, is Khairul Anwar, who is Enterprise Singapore's regional group director covering Indonesia. Khairul, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for having me on this podcast.
Okay, so today we're going to chat a little bit about the results of OBG's recent Indonesia survey that covered 112 C-suite executives. These are surveys that we conduct in every emerging market where we operate. We call them business barometers. The idea is that they are supposed to give us a better understanding of the sentiment among corporate decision makers. So we ask the same 10 questions in every market, plus a few country-specific questions. So today we'll delve into some of the more interesting results to try and contextualize them. But before we do that, Khairul, why don't you give us a brief update on the work of Enterprise Singapore in Indonesia? Now, Singapore is the largest source of FDI in Indonesia, so I imagine it must be a very important market for your organization.
Yes, it is. It's been keeping our team pretty busy, and we've grown in terms of the manpower we have on the ground just to meet that demand. So by way of an introduction, so Enterprise Singapore is a government agency of the Singapore government that champions enterprise development. So as part of that work, we've got offices in over 35 cities worldwide, whereby we work very closely with Singapore firms to look at business and investment opportunities, and to help them realize it or to provide information for them. So for me, I've been with the team, with the organization from late 2009, and today I look after the Indonesia team, and we have two presence in Indonesia. We're in Jakarta, where we have our largest team, and we've also got a second center in Surabaya, which looks after the eastern part of Indonesia, which for us is East Java eastwards. So as you've mentioned, I think we've got very strong bilateral trade and investment ties with Indonesia. We're the third largest trading partner after Japan and China. I think last year, bilateral trade was about 59 billion Singapore dollars. And we've also been top investor in Indonesia since 2014, and I think amongst the top 5 since 2001. So overall, I think both governments collaborate across a broad range of economic areas. One of the key platforms we use is this platform called the 6 Bilateral Economic Working Groups, where we interact and we engage with the Indonesians on a range of economic initiatives. The most notable ones will include things like Kendal Industrial Park in Central Java, Nongsa Digital Park, Batam, and the development of cruise tourism and the digital economy. And to cap it all off, I think if I were to pick sort of where we spend most of our time in terms of business facilitation, it would be these 4 sectors. Consumerism as a theme, that's a big thing for us because of the size of the market. Advanced manufacturing has been seeing quite a bit of interest, especially since the Indonesian government launched the Making Indonesia 4.0 initiative earlier this year. So we've seen quite a bit of interest on both sides to collaborate more closely on this. Cruise tourism, as part of the 10 New Balis initiative that the government has been championing. Smart cities and infrastructure being the one to, in line with President Jokowi's drive to increase the implementation of infrastructure to meet the infra gap. And lastly, I think this is a new area which is trying to facilitate collaboration between both startup communities, both in Indonesia and Singapore, and to see what opportunities come out of that.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting topics there that we'll probably touch on a bit more as we go into the survey. Indonesia is also one of the most important markets for Oxford Business Group, being as it is a G20 country with such a vast population, huge consumer-driven internal market. Definitely in terms of our subscribers, it's definitely one of the more talked about projects that we do. So if we go straight into the survey, we ask a question just on general business sentiment, what the CEOs think of business conditions in the year ahead. Now, obviously, this is quite an interesting time for Indonesia. We're approaching the 2019 elections. 80% of the CEOs that we spoke to said they had a positive or very positive outlook for business conditions in the year ahead. This was even higher than the sentiment recorded in our last survey published in January, which was 76%, which is quite striking considering election brings uncertainty in itself. And this year, Indonesia's faced certain headwinds. The rupiah, for example, has been under sustained pressure with the sort of capital outflow from emerging markets that we've witnessed. So what do you think are the reasons for such optimism amongst executives despite these internal and external headwinds? And to what extent could this be seen as a corporate endorsement of the Jokowi administration's handling of the economy?
So in general, we see Indonesia as having fairly sound economic fundamentals, and I think that's something that the rating agencies and the World Bank and IMF have acknowledged. I think overall, the companies from Singapore, I think we see a country where growth is stable. Right, we're looking at growth projections of around 5.2% this year, almost level what it was last year, despite some of the challenges in the news. And while the government is prioritizing some projects, due to the lower rupiah, for example, what we see is that it's still proceeding with its economic development strategies in areas such as infrastructure, human capital development, and improving the business environment. For example, I think by reviewing the negative investment list from time to time. So for us and for the companies we work with, I think this shows that by and large, the government has been taking a long-term view of the economy, which might be one of the reasons you've seen such a positive response. I think with regards to consumer-oriented businesses, I think they continue to be attracted to Indonesia. The simple fact is that you've got a huge consumer base, 260 million people, of which, depending on who you read, about 80 million consuming middle class. And this growth of the middle class opportunities is very critical for a lot of our companies who need to achieve scale. And they're looking at sectors such as healthcare, food, retail, and education. And the fact that Indonesia is such a young and bustling population, very high mobile penetration rate, who seem to be able to absorb and adopt technology very quickly in new platforms. It's made it a fairly exciting market to also test new platforms.
You touched on the issue of infrastructure, which is obviously one of the long-term challenges that the country faces with this, vast land mass spread across 13,000 to 17,000 islands, depending on who you talk to. Infrastructure was a key focus of President Jokowi's first term, and he had started out with this ambitious pipeline of 245 priority projects, plans to add 35 gigawatts to the national grid. Obviously, the national budget of Indonesia is unable to meet all the costs involved in these infrastructure efforts. And the government was trying to catalyze more private sector involvement in infrastructure development. So in our survey, we asked executives for their opinion on how successful the government's been in strengthening PPPs. It's kind of a mixed results. 43% said it had been successful or very successful. 29% had a negative view, and 23% remain neutral. Where do you think further improvements could be made to attract more private sector participation in infrastructure development in Indonesia?
Okay, so for the infrastructure companies that we work with from Singapore, I think it's best if I maybe divide the answer into two. So in terms of interest in the market, I think interest in the market remains healthy. So we see a lot of utilities, interest in the utility sector. For example, in conventional power generation, renewables, waste to energy, wastewater and wastewater treatment. Also a lot of interest, consistent interest in connectivity, things like airports and ports, given the government's focus on its initiatives like the Maritime Toll Road. And there's another area of emerging interest we've seen, I think, over the last year or two, which is Singapore firms looking at what we call captive infrastructure projects. So these are infrastructure projects that supply large private developments, such as industrial parks, tourism districts with key infrastructure. So what we see here is basically these are what we call natural areas where a lot of Singapore firms have developed expertise in as Singapore advances in our own journey. And they're looking at various ways and various business models to share this expertise and contribute their services to the relevant sectors in Indonesia. So as I mentioned earlier, that there's a portion of this work that's going on a B2B basis. And with regards to public projects, I think what we think is important from the experiences we've had following key public infrastructure projects is a clear development timeline is important, the right pricing structure is important, with for example, tipping fees of waste to energy being in the limelight this year, and the appropriate amount and type of financial support from the government. So all this tree is critical to the viability of such projects and its attractiveness when we speak to investors and developers coming from Singapore. So because we've been active for quite a number of years in infrastructure, we're actually quite glad to see institutions like PTSMI, the Indonesia Infrastructure Guarantee Fund, coming on board to ensure more projects are structured in the right way. And this is an area I think we want to work very closely with the Indonesian government and also with Singapore investors in the year ahead.
I was recently at the launch of Infrastructure Asia in October 2018 that happened in Singapore. This is an entity formed by the Monetary Authority of Singapore and of your organization, Enterprise Singapore. What role do you think this organization could play in helping to bridge some of those infrastructure gaps in Indonesia?
Yeah, so as you highlighted earlier, so infrastructure demand is going to be a lot bigger than the government can fund on its own. So I think one of the things Indonesia has really put in a lot of effort to do is to improve the environment with regards to PPPs and to improve the attractiveness of projects to private investors. So this is where we feel, working together with them to attract investors and to ensure the bankability of projects is where, an agency like Infrastructure Asia can come in. So as you explained earlier, it was set up earlier this year by Enterprise Singapore and the Monetary Authority of Singapore with the main goal to gather and integrate the collective strength of Singapore and international expertise to structure, finance, and develop infrastructure projects. So we feel that Singapore over time has basically developed a fairly comprehensive infrastructure ecosystem. It includes developers, financiers, professional services, legal and arbitration, and other supporting services, not just Singaporean firms, but Singapore-based companies and also international companies that our companies in Singapore are connected to. And therefore, we see opportunities for bodies like Infrastructure Asia to catalyze cooperation between the various infrastructure players or industry players in the region to bring together the banks, the solution providers, the regional governments, so that feedback mechanism between a project is being structured and the private investors and the developers and the technology providers are a lot tighter.
Moving on to another topic that we always talk about in our survey, we ask CEOs about the external factors that could impact their economies in the short to medium term. Now, at the moment, we're in the midst of this ongoing US-China trade war and the America First policies of President Trump. Within this context, trade protectionism actually emerged as the dominant concern for Jakarta-based CEOs. 30% of which cited this as the biggest external risk to the Indonesian economy. Now, before you talked about the large internal market, consumption-driven economy, to what extent does this shield Indonesia from the worst effects of the global trade war?
So, I think the way we look at it, the current global trade environment presents both. You've got opportunities and challenges to countries in ASEAN, not just Indonesia. And from our perspective, what we're seeing is the ASEAN countries remain fairly committed to greater economic integration. And what that means for us is one way of strengthening the resilience against the impact of this global trade tensions is we're trying to increase the connectivity, the investments and the business relationships within the countries in ASEAN. So Singapore companies coming out of Singapore being very familiar with this region, I think we continue to see growing interest by such companies in ASEAN countries in markets of final demand. And actually markets like Indonesia, with a very huge internal market, make very attractive destinations. And over the course of the year, I think we've continued to see a fairly stable amount of interest by Singapore-based firms to come into Indonesia and meet Indonesia's demands for goods, services, innovation, investments. And I think over the last month or so, as the rupiah has stabilized, I think it's corroborated assessments. I think that Indonesia as a whole has very sound fundamentals, and the government itself, I think, has been very proactive to the situation. So all in all, I think for the macro picture, Singapore firms look at Indonesia, they see a country with fairly stable long-term fundamentals that they want to participate in.
One of the policies you mentioned earlier was the Making Indonesia 4.0 strategy. How do you assess the prospects for Indonesia when it comes to developing high-value exports beyond its commodities base? And what role do you perhaps see for Singapore firms, investors in helping Indonesia transition towards more advanced manufacturing?
So we feel the launch of the Making Indonesia strategy in April this year was timely to prepare Indonesian manufacturers and also workers to take advantage of the long-term opportunities that are going to emerge from the fourth industrial revolution. The full and long-term impact for ongoing global anti-trade sentiments is still very hard for us to discern, but we think it's still a wise move overall to prepare the economy in Indonesia to benefit from such a major technological shift. Singapore ourselves, we are embarking on our own Industry 4.0 journey in Singapore. We see an opportunity here for our government agencies, our manufacturers, technology companies in R&D community to strengthen the linkages to Indonesia and to share their experiences and engage with companies here that are looking to upgrade their manufacturing capabilities in areas such as automation, industrial Internet of Things, and system integration. So this is something that we're working very closely with the Indonesian Ministry of Industry on, and it's something that just last month in October, we signed a memorandum of understanding with the Ministry of Industry during the Leaders Retreat in Bali.
One of the things you touched on in your answer was the sort of impact on the labour force. Now, Indonesia does face quite stark challenges when it comes to ensuring its workforce is equipped for the needs of high-value industries. There was a report in Bloomberg recently that showed, I think, a mere 17% of the 127 million Indonesians in employment have finished high school, and less than 10% have graduated from university. That's obviously a huge difference to the Singaporean labour force. We asked our CEOs to pinpoint the skills that they felt were most in need in the labour force. 32% chose leadership, 21% chose computer technology, 20% engineering, 16% research and development. I mean, just speaking generally, how big of a challenge is education and skills development for the next administration, whether that's led by President Jokowi or not? But I mean, the big focus in the last term of Jokowi was on infrastructure development. I mean, do you feel like the next big challenge for Indonesia is perhaps looking more at the human capital side?
So education and training are, they're core areas to any country's development, and a key way to ensure that all the benefits of economic growth and investments, they accrue to the local population through good jobs. So we expect, I think, any Indonesian government, Jokowi or not, will always place an emphasis on this area. And what we've seen, I think, in both in the media over the last few weeks is the current administration themselves has been sending the right signals and emphasis on the need to lift Indonesia's the quality of Indonesian talent. So from the perspective of Singapore companies, we see strong demand for education and skills. A particular area that we've seen with the recent focus on the Industry 4.0 economy is interest by Indonesian partners in firms that specialize in vocational education and reskilling of workers. So as mentioned, we've got that ongoing MOU, Memorandum of Understanding with the Ministry of Industry on issues of curriculum development for polytechnics. So these are the agreements or partnerships that we hope to come together on to improve the quality of vocational training through the polytechnics, which is indirectly then going to improve the quality of labor in the market. And there's ongoing discussions with partners in the private sector to create platforms for the reskilling of adult workers, as different as the job market and the manufacturing sector begins to change. So definitely, I think there's an interest, very strong interest, both from the Indonesian government and also we see from the private sector, from the industrial park developers, from the manufacturers themselves. Strong demand for skilled talent and also strong interest in the last year to develop the capabilities themselves to train the next generation of workers.
Okay, that sounds very positive on the whole. Well, thank you very much, Khairul, for your insights today. I think it's been really useful in helping us to get a better understanding of the current economic situation in Indonesia at the moment, and also understand some of the sentiments expressed by our CEOs. And it's very good to have the outside Singapore perspective as well. So we really appreciate you joining us today, and we wish you the best of luck for all the very, thoughtful and interesting endeavors that Enterprise Singapore is involved in Indonesia.
Thank you very much, Patrick. I really enjoyed this quick interview.